We are now less than 1 hour away from President Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky meeting in Washington, D.C. All eyes are on the Oval Office. Is this going to be a repeat of February where there's going to be an explosive encounter on camera between the two? Or has sanity finally leveled in on Volodymyr Zelensky and he's now going to submit to what Trump has worked out apparently with Vladimir Putin in Anchorage, Alaska last week? To try and figure out where we are and where things may be going, we have back on one of the best and most exciting guests that we have on the show, Colonel Doug Macgregor, former senior policy analyst and former working with the Secretary of Defense under the first Trump administration and highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, as always, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Dan.
Well, listen, I mean, let's just kind of just jump right in. I mean, you can even talk about a little bit of what you think happened last time in Anchorage and what that's going to mean for this meeting here. But kind of what is your expectation of what's going to happen today?
I think, well, first of all, I'm hopeful that Zelensky wears a suit and tie and does not show up in this ridiculous costume as though he's coming directly from the battlefront, which is not the case. But I doubt it. I'm sure after the last episode, the president should make it very clear I'm not speaking to this buffoon again until he comes in here properly dressed. So we'll see what happens. I think ultimately the European leaders, and he's dealing with the committed globalists, frankly, in the West, working together with Zelensky, are going to do everything they can to drag him into continuous conflict and hostility towards Russia. That's their goal. They're not interested in this arrangement whatsoever. The bad news is the CIA, the MI6, and Mossad probably, they're all joined at the hip, are supporting the Europeans and probably trying to create conditions for more conflict. So I don't know what President Trump will do. I hope he stands his ground, but you know, it's not easy to know at this point.
And I guess the clue we have about where Trump is, you talk about stand his ground. This is what Trump has on his Truth Social has said about Zelensky. He said President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, or can continue or if he wants to continue the fight. Remember that it started. Remember how it all started. No getting back to Obama giving Crimea 12 years ago without being shot fired. No going into NATO by Ukraine, he says in all caps. Some things never change. What do you make of that?
Frankly, not much. I think we need to wait. President Trump needs to, well, I have my own views on what President Trump needs to do. I have no idea what he will do, but he ought to make it abundantly clear that while he's president of the United States, that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. End of discussion. Secondly, that the United States is not interested in dragging out this conflict and plans to suspend all military aid to Ukraine as soon as possible, is happy to provide humanitarian aid, but will no longer support any further hostile action against Russia, because he knows, and what needs to be said openly is that this is our war started under the Biden administration against Russia. The Ukrainians are just tragic victims in this whole process since we weaponized them and used them against Russia. But this is an idea that was created from the very beginning in Washington and London, and we need to be straightforward about that. But I don't know what he'll say.
Well, you mentioned the Europeans because there's the meeting with Zelensky, according to reports, at 1 p.m. Eastern time today, and then it's somewhere around 2 p.m. Plus or minus. Then there's going to be a big contingent from the European Union and NATO that's going to be there. One of the leading factors there is Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, who yesterday before leaving for Washington said this.
Ukraine must be able to uphold its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. There can be no limitations on Ukrainian armed forces. International borders cannot be changed by force. These are decisions to be made by Ukraine and Ukraine alone. And these decisions cannot be taken without Ukraine at the table.
Well, I mean, there's almost no accuracy in anything she said there. That Borders are changed all the time, as you said on our show many times. But for her to lay out that whole list of just one right after the other is exactly the opposite of what Trump said that he, or what many reported anyway, that Trump and Putin agreed to in Alaska, that they were close to an agreement on. So if she's coming in with that categorical, these things aren't going to happen, what is that going to tell you about the meeting at 2 o'clock today?
Well, I think everybody needs to ask the following question. What happens in Europe if this war with Ukraine, sponsored largely but not exclusively by Washington, ends? Well, if it ends, it's going to end, first of all, in Russian victory. That's a foregone conclusion. Secondly, it will end on terms that Russia sets. They're the ones with the forces on the ground. They're the ones with the vital strategic interest. We're not, never were. And finally, if that happens, and I think that's what's going to happen, what does that do to the leaders in Western Europe, these globalists who have been saying, open our borders, admit everyone who wants to come here from Africa, the Middle East, or even Southwest Asia. We welcome them all with open arms. We'll subsidize them, even though the majority are men and not even men, women, and children. We welcome everybody. And at the same time, we have to defend ourselves against a dangerously aggressive Russia that is bent on conquest and wants to conquer Europe. And what happens to those two myths, if you will? Well, myth number one is everybody in Europe wants everybody who's come in there since 2015 to leave. All right. It's been 10 years. They want the vast majority of these unwanted migrants to get out. That's the real crux of the matter in England. It's the crux of the matter in France. It's the crux of the matter in Germany, anywhere you go. And you know this from personal experience. They want them out. Number two, there's no threat from Russia. And that's essentially what President Trump demonstrated on Friday. Look at the way he behaved. Look at the feelings that were expressed publicly between President Trump and President Putin. There is no reason for hostility between the United States and the American people and Russia and the Russian people. None. That was made very clear. To put it in the parlance of people down south, we don't have a dog in the fight, okay? So I think President Trump is going to sit there. He's going to be polite because he is, by nature, very polite. And he's going to listen to them. He's going to say, look, it's over. We refuse to go any further. We are prepared for a solution. And we discussed that solution with President Putin, and we think that solution under the circumstances is legitimate. We will not support Ukraine inside NATO. We will support a neutral Ukrainian rump state. Now, here's the kicker. If you, ladies and gentlemen from Europe, are determined to press ahead, that is your privilege. You are sovereign states. You can do it without us. That's what he's got to say. I'm removing our forces. We've got a lot of forces on the border. We still have a lot of people in and out of uniform in Ukraine. I'm getting them out. This war is over. I'm suspending aid to the man in costume here with his little pretend combat uniform. It's over. I'm not going to support this any longer. I've given specific orders to that effect. If that's unacceptable to you, once again, it's your sovereign right to do whatever you think is appropriate, but do not include us because we want nothing to do with it. That's really what he has to say. He can beat around the bush. He can be polite, but that's the message. And the real question is, how long will the globalists in charge last when that becomes clear? I don't think the vast majority of the Europeans have any interest in a war with Russia. I don't think they really believe the Russians are coming. Remember that movie back in the 70s? The Russians,
Yeah. Russians are coming. Yeah.
They're not coming. He said, President Putin wants an end to the war. He does. President Putin doesn't want anybody else to die pointlessly. He does. This is over as far as President Trump is concerned. But for him to be effective, he's got to deliver that message to the NATO alliance. Now, you and I have talked about this offline. I think NATO is finished. I think the EU is on crutches. You know, NATO is already a terminal patient on the slab, hooked up to various things to keep it alive. And these people want to give it a haircut and a shave and send it back into combat. It's not going to work. This is a corpse. This is a comatose human being waiting to die. Europe has to move in new directions, divorced from the past. We've reached the historic inflection point, what we call the strategic inflection point. Europe has to become responsible for itself. It has to answer the question, who's going to be your first responder? Because it's not going to be the United States. These are the things that President Trump has to make clear. Will he do that? I don't know. Will he buckle? Will he reconsider and say, well, after I talked to all of our allies, I realized we have to stay. No, come on. It's all nonsense.
Well, and in fact, the allies they certainly have a unified position, because for all the things you saw Ursula von der Leyen, as she was speaking, Zelensky was standing right next to her, and when his turn to speak, he added this:
Putin has many demands, but we do not know all of them. And if there are really as many as we heard, then it will take time to go through them all. It's impossible to do this under the pressure of weapons. So it's necessary to cease fire. The constitution of Ukraine makes it impossible to give up territory or trade land.
So we have the potential there, and I guess you see on the screen there some of the Europeans are showing up. That's live, I believe, from Washington, D.C. right now. It's Mark Rutte. You have with Zelensky, his comments there, you have the potential there for some conflict, because Trump just less than a week ago mocked Zelensky for saying, oh, my constitution doesn't allow me to give up territory, because Trump said he worked out there's going to have to be some territory swapped to make that happen. And of course, the clear meaning is going to especially be in the Donetsk and Luhansk area, all of Donetsk, which Ukraine would have to withdraw from, the areas where they actually control some of the territory. And instead of acceding to that, Zelensky is entering this conversation saying, yeah, I still ain't doing that. What do you expect from this?
I think it's time for President Trump to say thank you very much for traveling all this distance. I'm glad we had this exchange of views. My position is very clear, and I'm going to make that clear when I make a statement at the end of this meeting. And you are free to go before the press and explain why you can't support my position and why you feel differently. But that's the end of it. Look, the strategic inflection point has been reached. These people want this war to continue because it's critical to their position in office. How do you stand up in front of the Germans, the French, the British, everybody else, say, we've been lying. Russia really isn't interested in the war against us. Russia doesn't want to conquer Eastern Europe. Russia is not this permanent enemy that justifies the existence of this alliance. So under the circumstances, we agree with President Trump. If they did that, it would be over for them. That's the problem. This is existential for them. It's not the threat from Russia. It's the threat inside their own countries, within their electorates. The electorates are going to realize this has been a big scam, and it will be over. Von der Leyen was formerly the defense minister in Germany. So she contributed in a very dramatic way to the destruction of German military power. Then she went on to reinforce the destruction of German national scientific industrial development. This woman is a catastrophe. She's a burden to everyone. She needs to be thrown the hell out of office. And I think all of this will happen if President Trump stands his ground. And forget the Lindsey Grahams and all the other buffoons, because all they're concerned about on the Hill is money. And if we don't do X, Y, and Z and continue this war in Ukraine, what does that do to the defense budget?
Well, yeah, that's a big question that they're going to have to answer there. I imagine they're already going to have some answers about, well, no, we have to get ready for the next war. That's what's going to come. I'm sure they'll have no problem conjuring up something for that. I want to ask you, given the images that Gary's showing there about this short walk from the car inside, you see a small red carpet there. What do you make of the imagery and the setup that in terms of where Trump's mind is and what we might can expect here based on how he greeted President Putin in Anchorage? There was a long red carpet. He was very enthusiastic. He greeted him warmly, had lots of good things to say about him. And I haven't seen if there's been imagery out here so far, but the reports were that other than getting out of the car and walking in, that it was going to be more businesslike. When you also look at what Trump tweeted out or in his Truth Social, where he was basically talking to Zelensky like he's talking down to him and Putin as an equal to him. How do you What messages can we get from how Trump is treating the two leaders and what we can expect today?
Remember from the very beginning, as soon as we had these first meetings in Saudi Arabia, President Trump expressed a keen interest in normalizing relations with Russia. Go back to his previous term in office and when he ran for election the first time in 2015, 2016, he was always about normalizing relations with Russia. He asked repeatedly, what is the basis for our hostility towards Russia? I don't see any. He's right. He's right again. And that's really what it's all about for him. I think he knows the truth, although he hasn't stated it publicly, that Ukraine is practically destroyed as a nation state. No one really knows what becomes of it at this point. But I think there's a very real possibility that this rump state that emerges will be very confused and chaotic initially. And I think his view is the Europeans have an obligation to step in there and help. We may also step in with some aid of some kind, but not military aid. As for the rest of it, he was trying to demonstrate to Putin, look, I respect Russia and I respect you and I respect your interests. Until this point in time, no one was ever willing to admit that Russia had any legitimate security interests in Ukraine, or for that matter, anywhere else. He's now said, yes, your security interests are legitimate. People here in the West may not understand that. That's fine. But I recognize you have legitimate security interests. I will respect those. I will work with you to end this conflict. Now, putting the F-22s out there and overflying it, that was stupid. Does he really think the Russians are going to be frightened by that? It's absurd. So that was unnecessary. But I think everything else was a success story. And I think the Europeans are afraid that he's going to do what I said. Now, will he? I just don't know. I really don't. It's hard to tell with him. He's, I want to say, almost mercurial. And when he faces all of these people, will he stand his ground? I don't know. You've got all these people in Washington that want to keep the money flowing. They want to keep the war going. They have an interest in this. In the meantime, I'm sure you saw recently that we were sending naval forces numbering in about 4,000 to the Southern Caribbean, ostensibly with Venezuela as the target destination potentially. You've heard the recent stupid remark by Bondi, who is probably the queen of stupid remarks, saying that there was a $50 million bounty on Maduro's head in Venezuela. Well, why is this happening? I think it's also a signal to some extent from Trump that what happens in our hemisphere is most important to us. And to us, that's a real potential threat. What's happening in Eastern Europe isn't. So I think I think that if you look at those two things, you put those together, it seems reasonable to me that Trump will stand his ground. But, he's like everybody else in Washington. They're all wishy-washy. They won't just call the spade a spade. They'll say, well, it's back to being a little bit pregnant. Nobody wants to bear the child, but they all want to be a little bit pregnant to tell everybody they're with them. I hope not. But that's a perennial problem in Washington.
Now, one of the other things I want to talk about here in terms of what we can expect is based on some of the statements by senior administration officials also yesterday. Witkoff raised a lot of eyebrows, especially on Fox News, when he said that Trump had agreed to potentially he said he had agreed that America could provide security guarantees for Ukraine as part of this. He claimed that Putin had authorized that he had agreed to it. And then later in the day, Marco Rubio was also on TV and he was asked about the same question. Here's what he had to say.
Any security guarantee that, the Europeans, there's a lot they can do and a lot they can offer. And it would be a huge concession. It would be a very big move by the president if he were to offer a U.S. commitment to a security guarantee. That'll be his decision to make. And I want people to understand that. That tells you how bad, if he does it, it tells you how badly he wants peace. Some more work is required before we can say that we have a plan on security guarantees that unifies us.
Yeah. Now, when Shannon Bream asked Witkoff are you talking American boots on the ground potentially for security? He wouldn't answer any of that question and actually changed the subject. So neither Witkoff nor Rubio said what they meant. But I mean, just this phrase, security guarantees from the U.S., certainly raised a lot of eyebrows. How do you interpret that?
I don't know the context for the remark completely. I always go back to the Austrian State Treaty in 1955, and Eisenhower effectively said that we would support that Austrian State Treaty, and he meant that he would respect the agreement that the Russians and the Austrians came to at that point in time. And the Austrian State Treaty has always been in the background of many people's minds. I mean, you remember when I wrote several articles on the subject during the first Trump administration over and over and over again. In fact, before that, I know John Mearsheimer has been talking about it. In 2014, I suggested there be a plebiscite in Ukraine and let those who were Russians vote their way into Russia. All of that was, dismissed, and great luminaries in the Senate like Menendez and Ron Johnson and Lindsey Graham all had heart attacks. all that nonsense. Those people are buffoons. They don't know what they're doing. They have a cocktail level of familiarity with reality. A guarantee, if the United States wants to provide it, and I think the Russians would like to be able to say that we are a participant in or supporter of the final arrangement, whatever it is. And that would be neutrality and non-membership for Ukraine with specific limitations on the size of whatever forces remain in Ukraine, along with the presence, I would think, of a Russian representative on the National Security Council in Ukraine. That, by the way, was the case for 20 years in Austria. There was a Russian representative there, and his entire mission was to ensure that the provisions of the treaty were carried out as promised, and they were. So the best deal that he had ever gotten in his life as a Russian diplomat was to live in Vienna, Austria, and the hell out of the Soviet Union. It was a much nicer place to live, but all he had to do was stand there and guarantee it, and it did. I think we could do something like that, but I think Rubio, once again, is the voice of reason here. He's saying guarantee what, and with what, and how much, and for how long. Those are legitimate questions, and they have to be answered before President Trump steps forward and says, I guarantee it, Let's examine this used automobile before we provide any guarantees. And I think that's really what Rubio was saying. And finally, France, Britain, to a lesser extent, Germany, certainly the French, the British, forget them. They're irrelevant to what happens in Ukraine. They're minor powers now. They don't have the military power, let alone the economic strength. Now, Germany right now is a disaster, but it could recover. And if it recovers, the Germans can make a difference. So it would be very good if the Germans agreed to back a neutral solution, an Austrian state treaty style solution for Ukraine. Again, that's hard for Merz, I think, because he's a globalist. He's part of the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and all these crazies that have been destroying Europe now nonstop for at least the last 10 years. But that would be helpful. But the people that must sign on, who are most important, are the states that border Ukraine. So who are they? Well, it's Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, and Romania. They need to sign on for this. They need to be at the table. Their views count. Nobody ever brings them up. And who are we seeing traipse into the meeting? I mean, look, I like Giorgia Meloni, but Italy, frankly, not really relevant to them very much. They don't care. The average Italian is more worried about illegal immigration and the rising criminality as a result than anything else. So who are the people that are most affected by this? They're the ones that need to sit down with Moscow. As I said, and the one exception that doesn't border it but has an interest in this are the Germans. And that would be useful for them to be present and support this. That's what we should look at. The United States can say, look, we'll support this in any way we can, but it may be that we say we can't guarantee it militarily, which is really what everybody's concerned about. Now, in 1955, remember, we had a huge occupation force in Germany, a very large force in very close proximity to Russian forces that were just on the other side of the dividing line in East Germany and West Germany. We don't have that anymore, nor do we need it, nor should we fund it. So we've got to be careful, exactly what Secretary Rubio said. Let's sort out what this really means, and then we'll talk about what we can and cannot do. I think Witkoff has less experience in these things and probably spoke too quickly.
Yeah, well, we're certainly going to find out that answer later today, too. One of the other things that Rubio said in that interview yesterday,
Mhm.
which I'll say a yellow flag, if not a red flag, but certainly got my attention also. And I hope that this is just a comment that he's making for diplomatic niceties or so to say publicly, and not that it's actually believed behind the scenes. Because if it is, we have another level of concern. In this, he's talking about how both sides really need to be on the same sheet of music here.
You can't have a peace deal between two warring factions unless both sides agree to give up something and both sides agree that the other side gets something, right? Otherwise, if one side gets everything they want, that's not a peace deal. It's called surrender. And I don't think this is a war that's going to end anytime soon on the basis of surrender.
Yeah, but do they,
I
Doug?
think he's wrong on that one. That's dead wrong. That would be like turning to us in Tokyo Bay and saying you can't have a peace treaty with Japan until we give up something. No, this is a loss, an unambiguous defeat of the West, not just Ukraine, of the West by Russia. That's the truth. Now, the Russians are not interested in aggravating anybody. I mean, if they were, they could have, the discussions with Trump would have been much less amicable. The notion that they're willing to discuss in Zaporizhia and Kherson, the renouncing some of the territory that leads to the Dnieper River as a way to get to some sort of agreement, I thought was astonishing. I mean, I don't know that anybody in the position the Russians are in right now would ever do such a thing. So I think that's not accurate. What he really should have said is that we've got to get the narrative straight. And this is why I got upset over the weekend with Mario Nafal, because he's repeating this phony narrative. Russia's the evil aggressor. Russia's been taking all these casualties. Ukraine's really haven't lost. And we just need to end this. So no, wait a minute. That's not true. Russia was goaded into this fight actively by the United States and its Western allies. It was a horrendous mistake. It has created the very thing everyone said they did not want, a militarily powerful and effective Russia. So it's time to back away from that nonsense and say, what are the security interests on both sides? Can we satisfy both sides? I think you could probably satisfy the Russians, but this man Zelensky and his backers are beyond satisfaction. You can't do it, Dan. You're never going to make them happy. So how do you get them on board? They're not going to get on board, and that we're back to President Trump. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your visit here to Washington today. We are out. We are no longer going to participate in this. We do not regard Russia as an enemy, and I am suspending all aid to the Ukrainian government. If you wish to continue supplying them, that, of course, is your sovereign right, but we will not do that. Let's see how long the Europeans last on their own.
And it could be that is where Trump's going. Now, I thought he was going to be there before. In this next piece, I'm going to play here from that same Rubio interview. It was strikingly similar to one he gave on April 18th of this year, when he implied that we were days away from walking away if we can't get the two sides together. And of course, the days evaporated, and now here we are months later. But in light of the Truth Social post that Trump made earlier about saying, hey, if you want to keep fighting, implying you can because you're a sovereign country, as you pointed out, here's what Rubio said yesterday.
If at some point it becomes clear that both sides are so far apart and so dug in that we're just not near a peace deal, then the president will have a decision to make about how much more time do we invest in it and what actions does he take then. But I want everyone to understand, if this morning the president woke up and said, I'm putting these terrible, strong sanctions on Russia, that's fine. It may make people feel good for a couple hours, but here's what you're basically saying. You're saying talks are over. For the foreseeable future, for the next year or year and a half, there's no more talks because there's no one else in the world that can talk to him. Okay, Putin's not going to meet with Macron. He's not going to meet with the UK. With all due respect to these leaders, none of these leaders are going to be able to bring him to the table and talk to them. There's only one leader in the world that has any chance of bringing these two sides together. If there is a chance, there's only one leader in the world that can do it.
Now, I think he's dead right on that there's nobody else that's even wanting to talk to about peace, much less would be able to, like Trump does. But the one thing that's different on this one than from the April one was that he seemed to imply, and how do you interpret this, that if this doesn't go and he does say you guys have it on your own, that he's not going to back it up with these secondary sanctions that he had talked about before?
Well, I hope not. I think all of these sanctions ought to be removed, period. We've got, 32, 33 countries under sanction for one reason or another. This business makes us feel good, but it just poisons the water. It harms people. It doesn't do any damn good for us. What is in the interest of the United States? Again, it is in the interest of the United States that we normalize relations with Russia. Normalizing relations with Russia does not have to mean the total destruction and conquest of Western Ukraine. Never did. It does require us to look at the legitimate security interests of the Russian people. Those right now are bound up with the territories that are occupied by Russians anyway in eastern Ukraine, and potentially Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. That's the way I look at it. And I think that's the way great powers historically would have looked at it. There's an old expression, possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, the Russians are in possession. We aren't, and neither are the Ukrainians or the Europeans. So it's shut up or put up. The Europeans aren't going to put anything up. So they might as well shut up and end this travesty, put an end to it, because this whole thing is a function of what we and London set out to do to harm Russia. And that's the way we need to look at this. It's failed miserably. It's backfired on us. President Trump may not have always understood that, but I think he's beginning to figure it out, and he wants to end it. So more power to him. If he does, God bless him, because we have other more important things to think about.
Yeah, and in fact, I'd like to look here in the last bit of time we have. I want to look at Zelensky, Trump, and the Europeans, and to what each of them risks, depending on how this works out. Let's start off with Zelensky, because he's got some risk here. He certainly doesn't want to repeat what happened in February or with this big blow up, but he's got some real problems. If he comes in after everything that he said and submits to what Trump said, then his political career is over. He probably won't survive that much longer. If he does and pushes back on Trump, then he could suffer exactly what you suggested, where Trump says, okay, good luck to you in your future endeavors by yourself. It's going to go on. So what are the pressures on Zelensky, and how does he navigate these today?
Well, I think what you said is part of the picture. The other problem is what happens when all of the mass graves are opened in Ukrainian territory that were filled with dead Ukrainian soldiers that were never returned to their families. What happens when mass graves full of non-military people, Russians that were killed, Russian civilians that were lined up and murdered? Go back to the first atrocity of significance, which was Bucha, back at the beginning of the war, and the attempts to blame the Russians for it when it was never Russian, it was always Ukrainian. What I'm saying is that this man is presiding over more than just the average organized crime state. This man is in charge of a criminal enterprise that has murdered countless numbers of people. He has also participated directly or indirectly with his government in the child trafficking, the trafficking of women, the use of drugs, the reselling of equipment to the drug cartels in Latin America, the reselling of equipment to terrorists in various parts of North Africa, the Middle East, and Africa, Central Africa. In other words, this man is very dirty in every sense of the word. He's not just standing in the shade, as we used to say. This man is dirty in the worst possible way, sitting on who knows how many hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars that have been pilfered and stolen from the American people and Europe, but primarily us, in banks all over the world. This is someone who should be tried in an international court of law. And sadly, we're complicit, but we can exonerate ourselves if we end it and get out of it. But he's very much complicit in all this criminal activity. So I think that's in the back of his mind. Is he going to survive in his little villa and vineyards in Italy? Is he going to survive in his private home in southern Florida on the Gulf? Is he going to survive in his other private home in Israel or something else? I don't think so. I think he's going to be chased for as long as he is alive. And ultimately, somebody will get him, and it may well be his own people, especially as they discover just how corrupt he and his friends are.
And what about on the near term issue? Let's say that he just doesn't come to Trump's side here and has to go back home and say, okay, I've decided we're going to keep fighting this war without the United States. How does he play that?
That's a good question. He is alive right now, I think, largely because of MI6 and the British, who have played a very critical role in preventing him from being assassinated or harmed in any way. As long as they're with him, I'm sure he'll survive. But at some point, he does stand an excellent chance of ending up like Benito Mussolini. And for your audience that may not understand Benito Mussolini, he was captured along with his mistress and others and brutally murdered and hanged by the Italian people. I don't think that's an impossibility in Mr. Zelensky's case at all.
It's not a very pleasant thing to think about, but unfortunately, he's in this position at nobody else's fault but his own. He has refused diplomatic off-roads everywhere, and now then this is what we have. Let's shift over to the European Union because they've also got a lot at stake here. You mentioned at the outset of the show here that they're part of this, this globalist group of people, and that certainly includes many in the United States, definitely in the previous administration, but even in some Republican circles, they want to keep the war funding going. They want to keep the war going, not win. I don't think they even think that. And so they're trying to do everything they can to get Trump to go back on what he was saying and just keep going with the flow here, et cetera. But if Trump doesn't do that, and actually let's look at both sections here, if you would. What happens if Europe, if they succeed and you get Trump to change his mind, but what happens if they don't succeed to get him to change his mind? Let's start with the second one first.
Well, if they don't succeed in turning Trump away from the direction he wants to move in, then I think the EU will break up before the end of the year. You've already got millions of Europeans who are angry with this tyranny in Brussels. You're talking about vast numbers of people living in different countries with different languages, different histories and cultures. They do not care to have Brussels dictate to them how they will live, what they will think, what they will believe, how they will educate, or anything else. So there's a real appetite in Europe, I would argue, to get rid of the EU. Now, if the EU were simply, which is what it effectively started out to be, an economic arrangement, in other words, a trade zone that allows people to trade back and forth across borders, I think it would survive. But it has become much more than that. It's a de facto bureaucratic government that is seen as tyrannical, unyielding, inflexible, and rigid. These are the people that are following the dictates of this man Schwab, who used to be the head of the World Economic Forum, and people like this Israeli Hariri, who practices destruction and death for everyone, who wants to legitimate all sorts of perversion. Europeans are fed up with all this sort of thing. So I think the Europeans will walk away from the current structure. Now, will there be other structures? And people ask me this all the time. What happens without the EU? What happens without NATO? Well, we're about to find out. And we need to come to terms with the reality that people view the world from Berlin differently from the way people view the world from Rome, Madrid, Helsinki. Everybody sees the world differently. Everybody has a different set of interests. This whole thing has been held together for as long as it has by American military power, political influence, economic strength, and money. Well, that's all going away. I mean, we are no longer the great superpower we once were. Trump knows that. He wants to repair those things. He wants to restore America. That's what he's always been about. How do you restore it if you continue to drag these people with you that are essentially parasitic in nature? They're leeching off of us. Take the American military out of the equation, sitting in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, and what happens? Well, suddenly the Europeans are on their own, and it's back to put up or shut up. And I think they'll all shut up because they're not prepared to put up yet.
And let's take a look at the other option here. That if Europe gets what it wants, if they're able to, with all of these people coming in, I imagine that the primary reason why all these people came in person, all the heavyweights in Europe, because they want to be in one room with Trump and provide one unified front to try and change his mind. Because as you've said on our show many times, very often the last person in the room that talked to Trump is the one that he listens to, and they're going to try to get him to go back on this stuff and not agree to everything that Putin's asking for. So what happens if they succeed and Trump backs away from his willingness to just end the support?
Eventually, and I think shortly, President Trump will be humiliated because President Putin at that point will say, well, we have no choice. And they will march west. They will march all the way to the Dnieper River. And then the decision will come, do we cross in Zaporizhia or somewhere else and go south and north? South to Odessa and north to Kiev to root out the evil at its source. And then we're going to look ridiculous because what are we going to do about it? And the answer is pretty damn obvious: nothing. Remember, if you go back to April of 2022, you look at the arrangements that were offered at that point. They were almost heavenly compared to alternatives now. In other words, you could have gotten out of this mess. You could have spared millions of people from being destroyed, their lives, for being driven out of Ukraine and so forth. It was all wasted. If you stop now and you say, well, I know I met with President Putin, but after listening to you, I recognize you're right. I guess we just can't change anything and continue down this path. Then we're on the path to hell because we've already got this financial crisis looming very monstrously over us. I mean, today, whether it's Ray Dalio or Jamie Dimon or Warren Buffett, along with Luke Gromen or Jeffrey Gundlach, all of these people have told us, we're very close to failing completely economically because of the financial crisis that's imminent. So I think it would be disastrous for President Trump to do that. I think this is an opportunity to pull out of what is an unmitigated catastrophe for us and for the Europeans. So if he goes along with it, I'd say that he will accelerate the ruin of his presidency.
Well, in fact, let's shift over to President Trump, because he's the other big factor in this in terms of what could happen if he stays firm with what he has said up to this point after his meeting with President Putin and some of the things he's been sending on his Truth Social here in just the last 12 or so hours, and he sticks with his guns and he doesn't get pushed back on there, then either he's going to face the specter of walking away and letting all of this stuff burn down, or he's going to have to go back onto it. It seems to me it's one way or the other here. If he chooses to stand firm and lets people walk away, what is the risk that one, that he takes a lot of heat politically, domestically, because then he'll be accused for sure by all the globalists and certainly the Democrats that you literally handed victory on a golden platter to Vladimir Putin by walking away. How does he handle that?
Well, he has to be ready for the same game that was played in the 1950s. Who lost China? Remember that? That was very popular back in the 50s and the late 40s, and people went after everyone, including George Marshall, who really shouldn't have been over there trying to negotiate for us. He was a tired old man. He just wanted to go home and rest. After all, he'd just been through the greatest war in human history. But Truman wouldn't let him do it. The point is, that's going to happen no matter what. The usual suspects that want perpetual war in Eastern Europe, who frankly want perpetual war in the Middle East, who want to see a resumption of war with Iran, who wants to see this insane project for Greater Israel continue. They're all together in the same group. So you're not going to please these people if you act in the interests of the American people. But just as Eisenhower concluded in 1953, we have no interest in going to war with China over Korea. So we're going to negotiate an end to this thing. And we did. He's going to have to stand up and he's going to have to take the heat and say, I am acting in what I consider to be the best interest of the American people. And you know what, Dan? The people in Kansas City, Missouri, in Seattle, Washington, in Dallas, Texas, even northern New York, once you get out of New York City, obviously, they're all going to say, bravo, well done, President Trump. And he will repair some of the very serious damage that has been done to his base recently. Because a keystone in the edifice of his election was, I'm going to disengage from these pointless wars and conflicts overseas. This will be the first dramatic, concrete step in that direction. So I wouldn't worry what the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, that are all arms of various intelligence agencies in the United States, and they're bought up and paid for by the oligarch billionaires that want war in perpetuity. The hell with them. They don't count. You're president of the United States. You are the commander in chief. You are the one person who can stand up and always speak decisively in the interest of the American people. You can define that interest, and that interest is clear. It is peace. It is not war. And if he has any questions about it, he just needs to fly to the places I mentioned, hold some private meetings, and he'll find out. Nobody is interested in this catastrophe in Ukraine at all.
And let's look at on the other option here for Trump from a positive perspective. What happens if he succeeds in getting Zelensky and these European leaders and they finally recognize we can't do this alone. This is the best chance we get, and he actually gets approval, and there turns out to be, by the end of this month and possibly even by the end of this week, a meeting between Zelensky, Putin, and Trump.
I don't know. I think it's potentially good, although I would prefer to see someone else represent Ukraine other than this man Zelensky. I think that's a huge problem for all the reasons that I've already cited. But I think he could succeed insofar as disengaging us. The Europeans, look, the Slovaks, the Hungarians have already said, forget it. The Romanians voted for someone that was then barred from taking office because he said, forget this war with Russia. We're not interested in it. So we managed to manipulate, using the CIA, manipulate the outcome in Romania and install some globalist figure who went along with the rest of NATO. Nobody in Bulgaria wants a war with the Russians. I don't think the Poles are interested in it. We have a new president in Poland. He's an intelligent man. He can read the tea leaves. The tea leaves are pretty obvious. The wind has changed, and there's no interest in going to war at all. He also has to deal with the reality that thousands of Polish soldiers who swore allegiance to Ukraine and fought in Ukraine are dead. What was that for? And I think Poles are now beginning to say this was a dumb idea. It'll take a while for the Baltic states to figure it out. They seem to live in Never Never Land. But bottom line is, I think if he does what he does, it's probably going to ultimately foster new centers of power in Europe that will ultimately replace the current NATO structure. I think that's a good thing. I mean, that's long term. My prediction is NATO goes away as it currently is organized. You get new security arrangements that will make sense on the basis of a true commonality of interest between certain states. That's coming.
And the last question I have here for you, let's look at the Russian side. What if you could look at the two potential options for Russia? One is that Trump is able to get the Ukraine and Europeans on board. Where does it go there? And then the alternative is that if Trump can't get anybody on board and walks away, what does that mean for Russia?
Well, I've said already that the Russians will continue to move west and establish the finality of their victory. That's what will happen because they have the military power on hand. In fact, it continues to grow. 35,000 new volunteers every month. Their losses are now in single digits. I mean, they used to be, a few hundred every month. Now they're down to 80, 90 every month. And I think it'll fall even lower. So they don't have a problem with attracting manpower, and they've gotten very good at training it, equipping it properly. They can make sure that all of these troops have what they need. So I think they'll just continue west. They'll simply say we have no choice. It's the only way to secure our national interest. And I think that's what will happen. Now, what do they do with us? I think they shrugged their shoulders and said, well, what do you expect? Good intentions, but no follow through. And that's effectively what President Putin has noted about a series of presidents that we've had. He said, I had good relations with all of them. They all seemed very sincere. They all wanted to do good things, and it never happened. And then he attributes that to this so-called deep state, which I think is a misleading statement. But it's not unreasonable for him to assume that. So I think that's what will happen with him. Now, the good news for us, if President Trump is successful, he holds the line against these fools who want to impale themselves on this pointless war for all the reasons we've cited, this globalist cabal. This will open avenues for us with China, because Trump is another one who said very early on, well, there are a lot of things I don't like that the Chinese are doing, but I don't want a war with China. I can go back and find many instances where he made that clear. I see plenty of evidence that President Trump feels the same way today. So I think that this step with Putin, if it is carried through and we truly divorce ourselves from this nonsense, disengage and pull out, this is where actions count. It's not enough to say, we'll support this, we'll support that. We've got to demonstrate our seriousness. That is to get the people, the intelligence types, the troops, the soldiers, the officers that have been training Ukrainians, get them out of Ukraine. That all has to happen. If those things happen, I think what you're going to see is an avenue of approach to China would help us to resolve a lot of our differences there. But that's beyond the range of our discussion right now, but that's my feeling.
Well, that would certainly be good. That would make getting this war off the table a good thing for us, to pave the way to something even better, which would provide security and increase our chances of success just across the board. And in that regard, if Trump can pull off something like that, then he can certainly go down as a very effective president. But everything depends on really what he does today. So all eyes are on Washington. And apparently Zelensky's getting ready to show up, and we'll see how that's going to happen if we're still on the screen. But really appreciate you coming on today, Doug, because as always, you really kind of cut to the brass tacks and talk about what's going to happen with this, and we really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
And we will see you guys soon too. If anything breaks, especially if there's anything that happens like in February, we'll bring that to you later this afternoon. Otherwise, we'll look forward to getting back with you very soon on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Thank you very much.